The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
In this rite of passage crossing over that we do, there is information communicated. You know, I talk about the history and I say, hey, this is what we're doing. But there is a depth of meaning that is somehow deeper than words that rituals tend to communicate.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Amy F. Davis Abdallah is a professor, a writer, a speaker, and a creator of rituals. Her latest book is Meaning in the Moment: How Rituals Help Us Move Through Joy, Pain, and Everything in Between. Starting with the foundation that rituals are a core and underexplored part of Christian practice, she draws from theology, psychology, and personal experiences in creating rituals for herself and others. In this episode, Amy and I talk about the difference between communicating meaning and communicating information. We talk about the ways we ritualize without knowing it. And I ask Amy whether she has rituals around her own writing life. Amy F. Davis Abdallah, I'm so happy that you're on the Habit Podcast today.
I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Your new-ish book, your most recent book, let's say, Meaning in the Moment: How Rituals Help Us Move Through Joy, Pain, and Everything in Between. When people ask what this book's about, how do you summarize it? What's your elevator pitch for this book?
It's a really good question. I think that I would say life is really hard, and it has lots of ups and downs and lots of challenges, and we are frequently in the middle of transitions. And so those transitions are challenging. The best way to help us through those transitions, whether it's a transition that we desire or transitions that are challenging, is by ritual. I think in my Christian tradition, I've very much ignored rituals as possibilities, even though we had our own rituals, and we'll probably talk about that later. But I think there are actions that we can do, particularly ritual actions, that will help us live well in our lives. And that's what I offer in the book.
Okay. Maybe we should define, when you say ritual, what do you mean?
Yeah, so I use ritual. It's a really hard word to define. I use Teresa Rando's definition. She's a clinical psychologist, and she says basically rituals are actions, but we'll leave it at actions. Actions that we do that symbolically represent what we deeply feel or deeply think. And so when you have a wedding, that's just a common ritual that most of us have experienced, whether for ourselves or for someone else. It is an action that is done that symbolically represents what is deeply felt or what is hoped for or what is thought. Christian worship is something that I do that represents what we think about God and what I think about myself as a human. And so the wedding, the actions that are done in the wedding are symbolic union of people. And I would argue that the ritual itself actually does something for the people. It's not just something that we do, but it actually forms the individuals there, and that our rituals form us.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when you said when you use that definition, that it I think you said it. I can't remember what the verb is, but reflects what we think or feel, what we deeply think or feel. What's the right word? What's the verb you use?
Yeah, it's symbolically represents.
Symbolically represents. But also, and you've already touched on this, it forms us, it shapes us into, hopefully. I mean, sometimes the ritual doesn't represent what I actually feel. It's what I know I ought to feel or ought to think. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And I think I want to be sure that we distinguish rituals from simple habits. So some habits are ritualistic and some habits are rituals, and then some habits are just simply habits. Both of them are helpful to us. But one of the things I say, okay, I hope you when I talk to students, I say, I hope you brushed your teeth this morning. That's a really, really good habit, but I don't think it's a ritual. And a ritual can be repeated or it can be a one-time event.
Okay. Yeah. Could you say just a little bit more about the distinction between a habit and a ritual? Because in common usage, those words do get sort of used as synonyms sometimes.
Yeah, I think what I would like to say is that not all habits are rituals, but some habits are rituals. So if I have a habit of daily prayer, if I pray every morning, that's a habit and a ritual because it symbolically represents something I deeply believe, and it forms me. I would say that it forms me, but there are habits that we simply do. Like I cook dinner for my family frequently, and so that's a habit. I seek cleanliness. I'm brushing my teeth and showering. I mean, those are really, really good habits, and we could say they point to our understanding of cleanliness. But it's more of a. You don't really have to think about a ritual for it to be meaningful, but it's not like something that feels really deep to me to think about the cleanliness.
So as distinct from a ritual cleansing, which sometimes happens.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a really good point because there are ritual cleansings that we do and there are baptisms. And so that is symbolically representing cleansing. And so you actually do the cleansing, you go through water, and there are different habits, different ways of doing it. I just threw that word habit and I got a little bit concerned because I used that, but there are different modes by which we accomplish that ritual. And it's something that we do in our bodies and that other people help us with that is pointing to not solely physical cleansing, but pointing to forgiveness, pointing to a cleansing from sin, pointing to these deeper understandings.
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. My non-ritual, I'm washing my hands to get dirt off my hands. A ritual cleansing is speaking to something beyond the physical dirt on my hands.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So your book is divided into 3 parts. Each part answers a question. Why do we ritualize? How do we ritualize? What do we ritualize? Would you run through some quick answers to those 3 questions? Why do we ritualize?
So absolutely. Why do we ritualize? We always do it. It's a human thing. Humans have always ritualized, and it's just something that humans have always done. So we do it because it's part of who we are. But we also do it, and I really especially like my 3rd chapter in the book, where I really look into the psychology of ritual and ritual theory. And there are some really greatly proven benefits to ritualizing. Rituals unite us. Rituals form us. Rituals help us. Rituals do things for us as a society. And I can't talk about that without also saying that rituals can also deform us. Yeah. Rituals are not always used for good and positive events in our society. Gang rituals. There are other rituals. And one of the things, so my audience is primarily Christian, and a lot of them are anti-ritual. They're like, we've never done a ritual. And then I like to point out, hey, you actually do rituals because this is how you do it. And you do it basically in the same way. And even though it's extemporaneous, you're making up your words as you go, you're still following a basic pattern and you do it at the same time. And you do this. And so I like to point out,
in a church service.
Pardon me?
Are you specifically mean in a church service?
Yeah, like in a church service. Yeah. It's kind of done in a regular format. And I just lost exactly where I was going with that.
I'm sorry, that's
But
my fault.
no, it wasn't your fault. I already lost it before you said
Then, so you were glad I interrupted you.
I was glad. I should have just gone with that and not admitted that I lost where I was going. But so we already are ritualizing. I guess was where I was going. That we're already ritualizing. And rituals can form us or deform us. Rituals do things for us and to us. And I would suggest that it's high time we intentionally ritualize, because so much of our unintentional ritualizing doesn't form us in the way that we would like to be formed. And so intentionality is really key. I do a lot of work, like I like rituals that exist, but I'm also really interested in rituals and creating new rituals. And that's what you see a lot of in my book. And so that's why do we ritualize? How do we ritualize? I have 2 chapters in there, which are ritual don'ts and ritual do's, like kind of like, this is what you should avoid. And so there's just some real nitty gritty stuff about what we should avoid doing. You don't do something because some other culture did it and you just kind of import it into your culture and say, oh, wow, isn't this cool? There's a couple of other ideas in there. But I think one of the most significant portions of the how do we ritualize has to do with symbols. What's really interesting about our senses is that our visual sense trumps all of our other senses. And yet symbols themselves as objects, so let's just talk about symbols are broader than that, like where we do a ritual, how we do a ritual, who we invite to the ritual, that is also symbolic. But if we're only going to talk about the objects themselves, they convey in just one object so much more than words. And I often talk about this wedding ring that I have on my finger that was blessed during my wedding, during my marriage vows, like right after that. And how this, yes, I wear it on my finger and it signals something to you. But if I were to take this off and throw it at my husband, it's not just a signal. I mean, that would be saying something so much with just a simple object that's just some gold, And so thinking through the symbolic, I think is something that, at least in my tradition, we frequently forget about because we don't think it's that important. We think that we're really just everything we experience is kind of in our brains. But the reality is we experience things visually and tactilely and with our senses. And that is something that God has given us, and it's really good. And so to be intentional about the symbols, and I like to be just intentional about the symbols just in my own life, even if they're not connected to ritual. So I have this little rock that has a cross on it that's in my winter jacket pocket. And it's not in both my winter jacket pockets because I have a light winter jacket. I live in New York, so I have a light winter jacket and then a heavy winter jacket. Yeah. And in that jacket pocket, when I go in there and I hold that rock and it has a cross on it, it just reminds me that God is with me at all times. Is that a mini ritual? Possibly. Is it primarily a symbol? Possibly as well. And so there are in the book, there's a lot of tips on how to create effective rituals that form individuals in the way that we would desire to be formed. And then what do we ritualize? There's so much we can ritualize, but I focus on ends, middles, and beginnings. And I start with ends because I get that from William Bridges, who writes a lot on transition, but I start with ends because saying goodbye well helps us say hello well. We think story, beginning, middle, end, but we don't end well. I don't think as a society, we don't grieve well. We think like you're over it immediately. In fact, we don't necessarily offer space for people to actually grieve. I mean, if you think about it, and if we're only thinking about death, and that's one end that we're all aware of and that we all experience, but there's so many other ends. But we don't, it's just like, okay, this is how many days you get off from work based on how close that person is to you. Yeah. And if they're not very close, you don't actually get any day off and you don't necessarily get a bereavement fare. And then you're supposed to go to a funeral. And then the next day you're supposed to be fine because you're going to go right back to work and everything's going to be normal. And within 2 weeks, no one ever asks you about it anymore. So but that grief, we know subjectively continues. And if you've lost a parent, you feel like an orphan for the rest of your life. At least that's what I've heard. I have not lost my parents. And so how do we say goodbye? How do we say goodbye well? I mean, how do our process. And other cultures have significantly more elaborate processes of grieving. And I'm not saying that's what we should do. And I think we can do this individually, but also as a subculture, like my church subculture. What will that look like in my church subculture? So I don't think we do well with ends. And then I also think we're even worse on our middle time periods. So I mentioned to you right before we started recording that I'm in what I would call a liminal time period, which is a period of unemployment. So the school that I worked at for 21 years closed. And I'm doing a lot of different kind of smaller jobs, but none of them is full-time. So I'm in between a state of employment, of full-time employment, and I don't know what's going to be next. I certainly have hopes and I certainly have interviews and I'm certainly applying, but I don't know what's next. And not only do people face times of unemployment, but there are multiple people in our world that are in chronic illness. And so you're in between a state of health and a state of possibly renewed health or possibly not renewed health. And so how do we live well in those liminal states? And I want to explore this more. I don't think I've explored it nearly as much as I could, but rituals can help us live well. Because here's the thing, everyone says, when someone has a chronic illness, they'll pray for healing. There's always this, okay, let's fix your problem. I was single until I was 39. I always had wanted to get married. And you don't have to want to get married when you're single. I mean, I learned during that time that singleness is a really blessed place, but I'd always wanted to get married. And so people always wanted to solve my problem. They didn't help me figure out how to live well in that liminal state. And so I don't think we do ends that well. I don't think we do middles that well. And I think rituals will help us process and live through them.
Can you give an example of what a ritual in a middle, in a liminal space looks like?
Yeah. So I've invented a couple. So there's a couple in my book. There's one that is just for liminal times. And I did this. I was preaching at a university chapel last week, and it's a real in the book I have right now, with friends, and at church rituals. So kind of three different types, and I have two right now rituals that come in the liminal chapter. And so it's just an action of, grounding yourself. Like one of the things that you'll hear a lot in mindfulness practices, you ground yourself. You've got your 2 feet on your ground, and it's not just it's the historical contemplative practices do this, and state to God about your ambiguity. Learning to tolerate ambiguity is actually a recipe for resilience. There's a great book by Pauline Boss called The Myth of Closure, Ambiguous Loss in Time of Pandemic. And she writes a lot about, okay, how do we become resilient people? But you state your ambiguity to God. And then you take something that's solid, like a glass of water, and you look at it and you say, wow, that's solid. And then you think through the solid things in your life. Like even though there's a certain area of ambiguity, what can you depend on? What is still there? And you drink the water and you say, in the same way that God, you've provided this water for me, because that is not a small thing. It is not a small thing to have access to fresh, clean water. In the same way that you've provided this for me, I believe that you're going to provide what I need. And there's another liminal ritual that I use. It's for empowerment in the middle of any task. When I was writing my book, that I would sometimes just reach spots where I'm like, I can't go anymore. I'm totally messed up. And so I just did it. It was kind of a breath. There's always breath with the rituals. Went outside, changed my location. And I suggest that you change your location. And I don't remember exactly how that one worked, but but it was just like, Holy Spirit, breathe in me to empower me to continue this. And then there's one that I suggest that hasn't actually been done, but it's kind of about marking time. So I haven't been really good at figuring out how to mark time during my stage of unemployment. But I would say particularly for something like chronic illness, or I would have loved to have done this for myself for singleness. And I look at this as a time in the middle, like at one point every year, like people come together. Hey, if you're in a liminal state, come together. And maybe I have a bracelet or something where I put another bead on every year. And I'm thankful for what has gone on. I'm also hopeful for something different I think that happens a lot in liminal states, but figuring out how to be thankful and then how to be hopeful and having some kind of symbolic object that helps you move forward. The truth is, I think there's so much more that can be done, particularly for liminality. And it's probably the most challenging because of the ambiguity. The very nature of liminality is ambiguous. And so how do you act out ambiguity via ritual? Ends are less ambiguous, even though there's ambiguity and anxiety in ends. And beginnings are less ambiguous, even though there's anxiety and ambiguity in beginnings. And that we don't recognize. But the liminality is just more challenging. And I'm really, really interested in doing some more work in that area.
Yeah. Maybe we should provide a definition of limit. We've been using the word liminality, but that might be helpful to have a definition now that we've been talking about it for about 15 minutes.
Yes, I'm sorry. I am a certified nerd and I use words, and I sometimes forget that people aren't necessarily familiar with that. Basically, liminality is a state of being in between. It's something has ended. And so unemployment, something that I had depended on for 21 years of my life, has ended. And I'm not yet to whatever is going to begin. And there's a liminal time period. Engagement is a period of liminality that many people have experienced. Education is a period of liminality. So you're within a liminal time period. And this term often comes from ritual theory and work on rites of passage in traditional cultures. And so it's basically like you're taken out of childhood. You're no longer a child. You're not yet an adult. And so during that time period, there are often tests and trials. You need to prove yourself. There are time periods of learning. And yet, I would say that we are constantly in a state of liminality between birth and death.
Yeah.
And so there's big picture liminality that we experience as humans. And then there are smaller areas of liminality. I don't have any statistics to back this up or anything, but I think we spend more time in liminal time periods than beginning or ending. And it's a state that we don't always acknowledge because it's uncomfortable. We want to, particularly I think in the West, and perhaps particularly in the United States, we want to have everything wrapped up in a bow, like everything's done. And we think we can control everything, and to embrace liminality. And that is what I do suggest in the book. Like, you can embrace it, and you can embrace it via ritual. To embrace liminality means to say, I don't have control. And the truth is we don't, we just like to feel like we do.
Yeah. Okay. So we've hit rituals of endings, rituals of the middle. Tell us about rituals of the beginning.
The beginning is the shortest chapter that I have in the book because I think we often ritualize beginnings. But what I do suggest is that we think, hey, let's do this wedding ritual, and then just like, go ahead, you do that marriage thing. We'll just let you go. It's only happiness and joy.
Yeah.
And I think in our beginning rituals, I think are missing the ambiguity, the ambivalence that happens, and the fact that beginnings are really hard. I think it's good to celebrate creating a new business. If you're starting a new business, absolutely celebrate that. Celebrate that day, do your grand opening, but don't forget, and maybe add to your ritual, don't forget that new businesses take a long time and that they take a huge amount of effort. And sometimes you feel like you're doing all of this effort and it's not rewarding you in the same way. But we like to celebrate beginnings because we think beginnings are really happy. And they are. They're also really hard.
Yeah. One thing you talk about that I thought was really interesting is, on the one hand, one thing that ritual does can do is sort of conserve the past, connect us to our past, but also, how did you put it? To bring transformation by increasing agency. So ritual, brings transformation. It's not just a function of preserving the past. I think a lot of times we think of ritual, especially a long-established ritual, as being something that preserves the past or conserves the past, and that's a great value of ritual. But I'd love to hear you say more about transform. I mean, you've already said quite a bit about transformation, but I suspect you have more to say, and especially that idea of agency. Like, what does ritual have to do with agency? So that was about 3 or 4 questions all at once. So I'll let you.
There we go. We'll see if I can remember even one of them. I'll work on it. Rituals do connect us to the past. And there's something really, really good about that connection to past history of humanity. As a Christian, for me, it's important for me to be connected to Christian tradition for the last 2,000 years. But the purpose is not to put me back in the past or to say that the past was right and we don't have anything new to offer now. And so that connection is significant, but it's not supposed to conserve it as much as it is to take us where we are now, connect us to it, certainly, and then give us increasing agency. I think frequently, and that I get that from Tom Driver. He's got a great book called Transforming Rights. It's an older book. I used it when I was getting my PhD. And he talks about increasing freedom, but freedom is such a weird word, particularly in the United States, that we think about agency. So what can I do now that I couldn't do before? And how does the ritual help me do something new? So let me give an example. I do and have been doing for more than a decade a rite of passage for women. We call it Woman a Rite of Passage. It comes from my dissertation research. And that rite of passage, the purpose of it is it's identity forming so that the women can walk out of their college experience, their undergraduate experience, saying, I am a Christian woman. I'm not looking for something else to define me. So how does that give them agency? Well, I connect it to their college graduation, which gives agency in the world, right? So it's kind of recognized as something, hey, you're now, to a certain extent, I think it's still a recognition of adulthood, although you don't need to have a college education to be an adult. It is one of those rites of passage, but it gives them a greater freedom and ability to be themselves. And particularly the concern, I work with a lot of Christians who look for the role with women, particularly looking for a role of wife as a defining identity characteristic. And for those of us who are married and those of us who aren't married, that is not our identity. It is a role. It is not the identity. And so to be able to say, I can function in this role, and because roles change, our identity remains constant. So I have the ability to choose this role or choose out of this role, and I will still be me, and I'm still a valuable human. And so whenever I do rites of passage and I consult with churches and they say, hey, we really want to do something. And I say, well, it's really, really important if you're going to do a rite of passage that your subculture has a way of recognizing what has gone on in these young people's lives and also what they're able to do now. Like, what are they able to do that's different from before? A wedding is a rite of passage. Like this ritual gives you the ability, your taxes change, for sometimes it's only women, but sometimes it's women and men. They change their names. You can change location. You move to a new place. You have this new agency that you didn't have before. And so sometimes I think with weddings, sometimes it's more clear in the traditional way that weddings, you left kind of from your family's home rather than from your individual home, and you weren't necessarily living together. But like, what is the greater agency that you have through the ritual? What does it give you power to do? And even if I look at this empowerment, the liminal ritual that I mentioned, where I'm like, oh, I went outside and I did something about breathing and I asked the Holy Spirit to empower me. That was just this simple physical, because rituals are embodied, simple physical ritual that I was pointing to, hey, I can't do this without you, God. And that gave me the ability to go back in. I was working in a library and go back in the library and actually finish the chapter that afternoon. And so it's not like, usually when you think about agency, it's an ability to do something you couldn't do before. But in that case, it is, but it's not like a higher task that I wasn't doing. I wasn't even accomplishing that task at all before.
The example you give at that moment in the book is an inauguration. In a presidential inauguration, you are connecting to, a past and a history. Although that in your case here, you weren't especially, that's not the part you were emphasizing at all. It was in this inauguration, I suddenly, now this is a new administration that's going to transform things for better or worse, but we've got some, it's really about looking forward. But it's also very much about looking back. So I think that's, and the new, it's also very much about empowering an executive, obviously. That's so good.
Yeah, and there's something, the inauguration that I was thinking of, and again, it doesn't have to do with political affiliation. It was moving. Like there was something that was aesthetically moving about this. Oh, wow. There's something that's happening. And one would hope that we feel that way in every inauguration, and every kind of, like you think about installation of a new pastor. We do these things because they actually help the individual who's being inaugurated or installed. It helps them feel empowered to do their task. But it also reminds us who are part of the country or part of the church that this is who has been chosen for this, again, for better or for worse, but like this is who is here, and it helps us kind of figure out how we are going to move forward into the future.
Yeah. One thing that you talk about is the idea that ritual communicates meaning rather than information. That's not self-evident, the distinction between meaning and information. So can you talk about that a little bit? I'd love to hear you talk about.
Yeah, I talk about meaning, and then I also talk about mystery. So I want to start with mystery.
Okay.
And this is something, so ritual theorists would say that ritual does magic. There's something that happens with people, and they say, okay, if you look at a traditional rite of passage, or if you look at these rituals that people have experienced, they're magically transformed. Like there's a magic that's there. And they're like, we can't explain to you why. And we also can't explain to you why it seemed to, quote, work for this individual and didn't work for this individual. But there are work is such a weird term, but it didn't seem efficacious, didn't seem to be effective. And so they talk about ritual magic. I like to talk about mystery. I think that when we do rituals and when we do them well, there's a mystery that of the transformation that occurs in the individuals there. I've been doing this rite of passage, and I use the rite of passage just because it's a really easy and measured kind of ritual that I've been doing. And what we do in our crossing over ceremony, so it's a year-long curriculum, and then we have this crossing over ceremony. And in that crossing over ceremony, the women present what they believe to be what a woman is. We give them necklaces, and then we bless them, and then we have a little reception and they leave. I mean, it's just, we use normal stuff when we do normal things. And yet so many of them come back to me and they say, Amy, something changed in the air when I put that necklace on, because when I walked into my office the next morning, I was a different person. And so I can't tell you why. I can't tell you exactly why this is transformative for people. I want it to be. I create the environment and we can say, okay, Holy Spirit makes this happen, right? But things are also transformative for people when they go through a gang initiation.
Yeah.
They become someone new. And so there's this mystery. And I think the mystery also connects to the meaning. Certainly, in this rite of passage crossing over that we do, there is information communicated. I talk about the history and I say, hey, this is what we're doing. And the women give some information, but it's hard to put this into words because it is less wordy. In the same way that a symbol communicates in multiple different ways, and communicates multiple different things. And this wedding ring, I can talk to you about my marriage till I'm blue in the face, but you'll never understand what this is actually pointing to, because I'm not sure I even fully understand it. But there is a depth of meaning that is somehow deeper than words that rituals tend to communicate. If you think about a wedding, and I'm just throwing out these rituals because they're ones that we've often experienced. If you think about a wedding, the way it frequently happens is the groom is waiting and the bride comes in and then they leave together. certainly you can say, hey, here's some information about what's going on with the marriage, but they're acting out what that means. We were separate people before we came here. We are now unified and we are going to be together, Lord willing, for the rest of our lives. And so there's some information, but it's deeper than that. And it's deeper than that. I don't know if deeper is the right word. Do you notice that I'm struggling with exactly how to explain that? Because you can't explain it with words.
Yeah. Yeah. On the other, if it's, I don't know if this is helpful or not, but in an inauguration, before the ceremony, you're not the president. And after the ceremony, you are the president.
Mm-hmm.
But
absolutely.
With a wedding ceremony, before the ceremony, you're not married. And after the ceremony, you are. I mean, something happens.
Mm-hmm.
And both of those have a legal dimension that maybe your crossing over ritual doesn't. But I don't know what the rest of that sentence is. But anyway, this is helpful. Okay, I want to ask you about, you've already mentioned one ritual you have related to your writing life that involves getting up and going outside and talking to the Holy Spirit and coming back in. Do you have other rituals that are, and it's okay if that's your one, that's fine, but do you have other writing related rituals? Because this is a podcast, the center of our target audience, let's say, is writers. I know that there are other people listen, but I always like to talk to writers directly when we can.
Well, believe it or not, I've never actually asked myself that question. And it's interesting because I spoke at Messiah University the last couple of days, and I was driving back from Messiah and I was listening to a podcast, and they were talking about the rituals of speaking. Like, what rituals do you do as you prepare to speak? And I'm like, why do I not do this? Why don't, and they're talking about listening to music and they're talking about getting in that space. I'm like, I can't believe that I just wrote a book on rituals and this is not something I'm consciously doing. And so I'm delighted to be thinking a little bit more like that as I move into greater writing projects. There are, for me, I have a place. I have particular ways. What I find more significant than beginning writing is how I end writing and make myself prepared for the next time. So I don't know that I would call it ritualized as much as I would say that there are certain habits that I have. For most of my writing life, I teach Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and I try to get a good chunk of writing time on Monday and Friday. And so at the end of my writing time on Monday, if I'm not making like an off ramp of like, okay, what is my next thought? Where am I? Where am I hoping to go? Then I'll spend a whole hour on Friday completely just trying to figure out where I was. And so there are certain habits that I have, and I write in particular places. I don't have beverages. I'm thinking back to when I was studying for my PhD exams, and I had particular things that I ate and drank while I was preparing. And then I had those things when I was doing the actual act of taking the exam, because our senses do help us remember. And so I want to create rituals that work for me. Instead of being kind of proactive with it, I'm more reactive of like, okay, this isn't working. What can I do to fix? And it would be far better for me to be proactive. So I deeply appreciate that question. And I've got to be thinking through what's going to work for me. I think about preparing.
Write an article when you get this figured out. Okay. I typically, my ritual or my habit, you'll have to help me think through if this is a ritual or habit. At the end of my podcast episodes, I habitually ask, who are the writers that make you want to write? So I'd love to hear that from you, Amy.
Well, you sent me that question, and so I got a whole pile of books. And then I'm just like, it's really interesting to me, the people that I have chosen. And so I don't know if they're all right next to me here. I don't know if I want to tell you all of them, but the people who most excite me about writing are, of course, the people who are doing the kind of writing that I'm most interested in. And so I love academics who who are incredibly intelligent, but they also just make all these concepts available to the normal person. And so that's what I hope I'm doing. And so when I look at this, I'm a big Brene Brown fan. Like, the woman is absolutely 100% brilliant. I wish I could do some of the things that she did. She did and is doing and has done. But she just makes everything very accessible to other people.
Yeah.
Lauren Winner, love her. Kate Bowler. I mean, these are academics who are just really bringing things, and they're all women. So I see, I do see this more with these women that I deeply respect. Beth Allison Barr, with The Making of Biblical Womanhood that she recently wrote. My dissertation advisor, I don't think she's doing that much writing anymore. She's retired now, but Lisa Graham McMinn, I thought was really helpful with that. I have a friend of mine, Amy Peeler. She just recently published this book a little over a year ago, Women and the Gender of God, and she's doing great work there. And then I also have some males on that list. And so the man who wrote wrote the foreword to my book, W. David O. Taylor, he's just an incredible individual and
he is.
A deep thinker. He speaks a lot, and he's a theologian. I don't know that he would call himself a practical theologian. I would call myself a practical theologian, particularly because I work primarily in the realm of worship, because I don't want to do theology in my head without there being some kind of practical outlay for the people. And so Cutter Calloway, he also works for Fuller and does some great work with that. But then there's people over here. So I love learning about the contemplative practices of Roman Catholicism and Christian Orthodoxy, because I think there's so much that I, as a Protestant, can learn from them. I really, really love James Martin. He's a Jesuit. He's actually really close here. And I got into his work when I read My Life with the Saints, and because I was just like, saints, what are saints about? And I started reading this, and he's telling you these stories about saints and about how it interacts with his life, and then suddenly you know all about this individual saint. And so it's this incredible way of working with that. I also like really practical people. One of the books I use in the book Meaning in the Moment is Priya Parker's work in The Art of Gathering. So some of that practical, I mean, she's a deep researcher, has done a huge amount of work, but you're just like, okay, how does this apply to my life?
That's on my wife's bedside table right now, that book.
Is it? It's fantastic. Yeah. It's super helpful. And she's done a couple other things as well. She's really, really interesting. But even as I look at that, I'm like, wow, I've got to expand. I love, I enjoy fiction. Fiction is helpful to me. I don't write fiction, but getting a steady diet of some, and I prefer some of the classic fiction, getting some of that in me helps remind me of that kind of creativity. I want to combine creativity and practicality and good, deep thoughts and theology in my writing. And so these are people that I see are doing that.
Right. Well, Amy F. Davis, Abdallah, thank you for being here. This has been a lot of fun to talk. And I'm really interested in that difference between ritual and habit, and I'm going to do some more thinking about it.
It sounds great. Thank you so much for having me. It was fun to be with you.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.